Hi and welcome to our lesson today, Life Sciences. We're looking at, for the grade 10s and 11s in particular, the skeleton, the human skeleton. And today we're going to focus on the two different parts of the skeleton known as the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Later on in the program for the grade 12s, we're going to be looking at an extension of our ideas on the human nervous system. So stay with us, grade 12s. Grade 12s, you can also revise a whole lot of information on the axial skeleton now, because that's very important in terms of the way it protects the central nervous system. And so our ideas today are very much linked, and I'm sure you'll all find all of it has some relevance to what you're studying. Let's focus straight away, though, on the axial and the appendicular skeleton. Last week you saw this picture, and I told you that the green part of the skeleton was the axial skeleton, axial meaning the central core, and the appendicular skeleton is the purple parts, the parts that are hung on as kind of appendices, extras, as you would possibly want to describe it. So the axial skeleton is made up of the skull, the vertebral column, the ribs and the sternum or the breastbone. The appendicular skeleton is made up of the pelvic girdle, that's your hips, the pectoral girdle, that's your shoulders, and of course the limbs that are attached to those two girdles, your legs and your arms. This diagram very clearly shows the axial skeleton. And it might be a good idea if you were to go home and find a picture of an axial skeleton or of a skeleton and lightly shade in what makes up the axial skeleton. Remember, we said it was the skull, the whole of the vertebral column, this bone here, set of bones called the sternum, and the ribs. So let's look at those in detail. The skull and the ribs, remember, protect vital organs such as the brain, the heart and the lungs. We covered this last week. The vertebral column protects the spinal cord, and we could say that those are your most vital organs. And so the role of the axial skeleton is vital in protecting your most basic functioning organs. Let's face it, you can survive without your arms and your legs, but you cannot survive without your spinal cord, your brain, your heart and your lungs. And so if you think of your axial skeleton as being the core part of your skeleton that protects and supports the core, most highly important or vitally important organs, that is what we're focusing on. Remember also last week I told you that your cranium or the skull is made up actually of many different bones all fused together. There's, for example, that huge bone called the parietal bone. You do not need to know the names of these bones. All that is really important is that you know that the bones are all fused together. This one here in the front, over here, is called the frontal bone. This bone here that makes up the arch over your cheek is called the zygomatic bone or the zygomatic arch. Here is one of the bones that probably you should remember the name for. That's the mandible or the lower jaw. This is your maxilla or your upper jaw. Please don't forget that your teeth are in fact part of your skull. This bone over the top of your nose is called your nasal bone. And so you're probably familiar with a number of those names. Right inside, if we were to drill a hole that way and line it up along like that, in that plane, you've got the three very important bones that make up your hearing system inside your ear. And in a couple of lessons' time, we're going to look at how the ear functions to bring about both hearing and balance. Moving down from the skull, we've got the ribs. Remember that inside the rib cage, you're going to find heart and lungs. Now, the ribs themselves, we have 3 different kinds of ribs. We have what we call true ribs, and a true rib is attached at the back to the vertebral column and at the front to the sternum. So those are called true ribs. We have what we call false ribs, which are attached at the back to the vertebral column, but here you can see in the front, they're actually attached to the rib above, and they're called false ribs. And finally, we get what's called floating ribs that are only attached at the back and they do not attach to the front. Here we can see the rib ends right there, the rib ends over there. It's not attached to the sternum at all. And what does all this attaching? What we call cartilage. Cartilage is a much more flexible material or tissue than what bone is, and so it allows for a much more flexible kind of attachment that allows for movement in the form of breathing. After the break, we will continue looking at the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. See you then.